The American Beatles, Neil Young, CSN and Y. In 1970, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young were more or less the biggest rock band in the world. The Beatles had split, Bob Dylan was laying low. CSN and Y found themselves as the standard bearers for the newly self-aware Woodstock nation, figureheads of the counterculture. They'd reached this level in just over 12 months. They'd gone from being a straightforward vocal trio harmonising in Joni Mitchell's living room to being dubbed the American Beatles by Bill Graham a year later. So how did this happen? And how did Neil Young get into the group, not just as a collaborator, but as an actual initial added to the name of the group? To understand fully, what we need to do is we need to wind the clock back right to the Buffalo Springfield days so we can look at the dynamic between Stephen Stills and Neil Young. That's going to be very important to the rest of the story. March 1967, Stephen Stills and Neil Young's group, Buffalo Springfield, have just scored their first and only top 10 hit with Stills' For What It's Worth. Young's contribution to that song, remember, is the distinctive chiming guitar note that hooks you in right from the start. In the wake of this success came bigger gigs. They were booked for the Monterey Pop Festival in June of 67 and offered a spot on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, a chance for huge exposure. Neil Young, though, being Neil Young, wasn't feeling it. He called a band meeting and told them he was leaving the group. He had clashed with Stills over song choices, in particular over Mr. Soul. Stills didn't want it as the next single. He had issues with it, saying it sounded too much like the Stones' Satisfaction, which to be fair, it does a little bit. Young took it very personally because he was still vulnerable at this time, at this young age, to criticism of him and his music and his voice. Young said he was very highly strung at this time and would go off at the slightest thing. He was also taking a lot of Valium, trying to keep his bouts of epilepsy under control. The band convinced him to stay for the summer, at least, though, through the Monterey gig. Young relented and agreed to stay. However, just before the Tonight Show appearance, when they were booked in for some East Coast dates, including Boston, Young suddenly disappeared. Nobody could find him. He couldn't be contacted by phone. His bandmates left in the lurch. They understandably felt quite aggrieved. Here's Neil's side of the story. This is what he said. It was over when the Springfield wanted to do the Johnny Carson show. What the fuck were we doing the Johnny Carson show for? It was another of Stills' things, and he was right. If the Springfield were going to make it, they had to be seen by lots of people, but I didn't want to be seen doing that. I didn't want to do it that way. What he did want to do was get together with Jack Nietzsche, a genuine musical maverick who had been Phil Spector's right-hand man, and the pair produced Expecting to Fly. Not only a brilliant song, but an absolute jaw-dropping production that rivals anything off Sgt. Pepper.
There you stood on the edge of your feather, expecting to fly.
Meanwhile, at Monterey, David Crosby joined Stephen Stills on stage for the very first time, sitting in for Neil with Buffalo Springfield. He also appeared with the Byrds, but it wasn't to be his finest hour, as for reasons only known to himself, he decided to freestyle a bunch of demented onstage commentary about LSD and the Kennedy assassination. At the same time, somewhere out on a desert highway, Neil Young was listening to the radio in Jack Nietzsche's car, and he heard the DJ, B. Mitchell Reed, come on the radio, having just played Mr. Soul, wistfully noting, when Neil was with him, baby. Neil Young sat up and took note of those words. Something clicked in his head, and he knew he had to come back to the Springfield. So he went back to the group, and armed with his newly recorded masterpiece, Expecting to Fly, they welcomed him back in, and they were just getting ready to go into the studio again to make their second album, to which Young contributed another multi-layered, overdubbed, big production masterpiece, Broken Arrow.
The lights turned on and the curtain fell down, and when it was over, it felt like a dream.
Buffalo Springfield again was released in October 67. Their second album is undoubtedly their masterpiece. It's rich, there's different textures going on, obviously influenced by Sgt. Pepper, but it's its own thing as well. It's without doubt the best Buffalo Springfield album. But as 67 turned into 68, there were still tensions in the group. In January, Stills and Young literally had a physical fight in the dressing room at a gig, having to be prized apart by the drummer Dewey Martin. Later that same night, bassist Bruce Palmer was busted driving home in his Camaro without a license whilst drinking from an open bottle of booze, accompanied by an underage girl who was also carrying weed. He was bailed out, but the following day, as soon as he got out, he was busted again, and this time he was deported back to Canada. Jim Messina stepped in to take over the bass duties. Buffalo Springfield recorded their final third album last time around quite separately. Neil Young would do his songs on his own, Stills would do his songs on his own, and the others were sort of just filling in. Basically, Neil Young and Stephen Stills both admit that they didn't really give a shit at that point, and the whole thing just came to an ignominious halt. So after the gig in Long Beach in May, they formally split up. Ahmet Ertegun, head of Atlantic Records, the band's champion, was devastated by the breakup, saying how far ahead of their time the group had been. Now, he managed to keep Stills on the label, whilst Young was now free to sign elsewhere. He ended up at Reprise. Ertegun was a huge fan of the Buffalo Springfield and was absolutely gutted by the band splitting up. As we get into the summer of '68, Stills was now friends with David Crosby and spent a wild vacation with him down in Florida on a boat, also with Grace Slick and Paul Kantner from the Jefferson Airplane. Together, Crosby, Stills and Kantner wrote Wooden Ships, and the first inkling of CSN emerged from the Florida waves. David Crosby had been kicked out of the Byrds in '67 during the recording of the Notorious Byrd Brothers. They fell out over everything. Musical differences, egos clashed. Byrds did not want to record Crosby's song Triad, which was about polyamorous relationships or threesomes. Jefferson Airplane were okay with it, they recorded it. And then in mid-'68, enter Graham Nash. Nash had befriended Cass Elliot when the Hollies had been in LA for the first time. Nash took to the West Coast hippie culture instantly, like a duck to the Pacific Ocean. This distanced him from his more buttoned up bandmates in the Hollies. Nobody remembers whether it was Cass Elliott's or Joni Mitchell's house, but there was an informal gathering of many friends and musicians. Stills, Crosby and Nash harmonised together for the first time over one of Stills' new songs called You Don't Have to Cry. Within 30 seconds, Nash said they all stopped and looked at each other and laughed because their vocal blend was so ridiculously perfect. They knew instantly that they were a group, and that's what they were doing now. Nash left the Hollies in December '68, and in early '69, the three of them went over to London and auditioned for the Beatles record label, Apple. It seems strange that the CSN were rejected by Apple, but that is what happened. Crosby, Stills and Nash had an apartment in London that they were staying in. George Harrison and Peter Asher paid a visit to them, and Stephen Stills says, we invited George Harrison over to listen to see if Apple might be interested in us. After we finished, he went, wow, and then he turned them down. Stills blamed himself a little bit as well, because he said, I didn't know if I offended George because I asked him if Paul McCartney could produce our record. He said, I think George was going to do it, so he might have offended him there. The Beatles tour manager and longtime friend Tony Bramwell also said there were some missed opportunities. They brought their demos into Apple and everybody loved them apart from John, who thought it was just twee nonsense, so they were rejected. But whatever the reason was, Crosby, Stills and Nash were rejected by the Beatles. Crosby, who was prolific on Twitter in his latter days, later tweeted, we did not record for them, it was a live audition, we sang the whole first record in London to George and Peter Asher. Apple passed on a #1 record there. Oh well, everybody makes mistakes. Bet they regretted it later. What they did get though was a management team that consisted of Elliot Roberts and future record label mogul David Geffen. Elliot Roberts was already manager for Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, so their new formidable management team landed them a 6-album deal with Atlantic Records. An easy sell to Ahmet Ertegun, who, like I say, was already a huge fan of Stills and the Buffalo Springfield. So they came back to the US from London. In February '69, they started work on their first album at Wally Hyder's Studio 3 in Hollywood. They worked quickly, and by the end of the first day, they had the foundations of Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. Stills laid down the entire acoustic guitar track, all 7.5 minutes of it, on the first take, from beginning to end. Straight after that, the three of them gathered around a single microphone and sang the entire song, 3-part harmony, into a single microphone. Now, that's impressive. So what you hear on the record is not a blend of 3 different vocal tracks that are mixed together. It's literally 3 people stood around a microphone. Maybe they need to move back a bit, maybe come forward a bit to adjust the mix, but that's how they mixed it, physically standing in front of a single microphone. After the vocals are done, Stills returned to the song and filled in all the other instruments apart from the drums, which was Dallas Taylor, but he played every single guitar, acoustic, electric and bass on that song, and that was pretty much how the rest of the album went as well. He did the keyboards, all the guitars, everything except the drums, and then you've got the 3-part harmony over the top as well. So the whole album is really a Stills tour de force. He sort of arranged the whole thing, played most of the instruments. The album was released in May '69 and almost straight away it became a hit. It sold 500,000 copies in the US, 4 times platinum. The band were heralded as the voices of their generation. Things would only get bigger from now on. Just around the corner there were some big changes headed their way. Because Stephen Stills had played pretty much every single instrument on that first album and it had become a huge success, now they had to tour it, and Crosby and Nash were quite happy just to keep it as 3 guys with acoustic guitars and vocals, but Stills wanted to put on more of a show than that and include the drums and a full band sound. So what they needed was more musicians before they could go out on the road. So they looked around for a keyboard player first. Initially they wanted Steve Winwood, but he was busy at that time with his own supergroup, Blind Faith, with Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker. So Ahmet Ertegun suggested, why not bring in Neil Young? So originally, yeah, they wanted Neil Young to play the keyboards, but maybe also guitar, and then him and Stills could alternate taking turns on the keyboard, but still pretty much, just an extra musician to have around. But Elliot Roberts, manager of Neil Young and now co-manager of CSN with David Geffen, laid down the law. He said, no, if you're bringing Neil Young in, he has to have full band membership, equal partnership. He gets songs on albums and his name should be in the band name. He's got to be a Y. Roberts was really looking out for Neil Young because he also made sure that whatever contract was involved still left him free to pursue his own solo career and still play with Crazy Horse. Now Graham Nash was not too happy with this, and it's understandable because they just had this huge smash hit album with the 3 of them. What did we need anyone else for? Having never met Neil Young before, Nash insisted meeting him first before he agreed to this momentous decision that would change the band forever. So they agreed to meet in New York at the Bleecker Street Cafe. Nash said, I had breakfast with Neil on Bleecker Street. After that breakfast I would have made him Prime Minister of Canada. He was so funny and so sure about what he could bring to the band. That's how we got Neil. So with Nash being completely won over and David Crosby being all for it too, CSN now became CSNY. And let's just think about what an amazing position this was for Neil Young to find himself in, joining a supergroup in the ascendancy who had just released a smash hit album whilst he could still retain autonomy over his own solo career at the same time and bring a huge audience onto his work as well. Adding that Y on the end as well also gave CSN an edge that wasn't quite there previously. Graham Nash said it himself. He said what Neil brought to Crosby, Stills and Nash was not only the ability to bring a darker edge to the music, because the first Crosby, Stills and Nash album was a kind of sunny, acoustic, gentle, breezy kind of affair, but all of a sudden Neil steps in, slightly dark, it's more intense. And what Ahmet Ertegun really loved about Buffalo Springfield was the way that Stephen and Neil would converse with their guitars. Neil would play something, 8 bars of this, and then Stephen would say, oh yeah motherfucker, try this. And that was very attractive to Ahmet and he felt we needed it. The dueling guitar solos of Stills and Young in Buffalo Springfield had been one of their trademarks of their live shows that was sadly never properly captured on their records, but it was well attested to by anyone who saw their gigs and the incredible guitar face-offs that they'd have. And now maybe they could bring those back to a bigger audience. Both Neil Young and Stephen Stills were very much on board with that. Neil Young himself said that the main reason for joining Crosby, Stills and Nash was that Stephen asked him to. They still needed a bass player though, so at first they brought back Bruce Palmer from the Springfield, but he was a bit too unreliable. They assumed it would only be a matter of time before he got busted again, deported or worse. So then one day Neil Young was walking down Sunset Boulevard when he bumped into his old friend Rick James. Yeah, the Rick James, who he'd been in a band with in 1966 called the Minor Birds, who were actually signed to Motown Motown. With Rick James was a very young, fresh-faced bass player called Greg Reeves, who was just coming through the Motown system. He played on the Temptations song Cloud 9, and he'd been mentored basically by the legendary Motown bass player James Jamerson. Both Reeves and Rick James had just been fired from a session with Ray Charles after they were caught rolling joints in the studio. David Crosby and Graham Nash later turned up at Rick James's apartment in LA, whisked young Greg Reeves off in the limo. Greg Reeves said, I never went back to Rick James's house. They all loved Greg Reeves. His bass playing was very energetic and very idiosyncratic, and they all loved it. With the lineup now complete, the now 6-piece band set off on their first tour. Their first gig was on August the 69th. August the 69th. The first gig was on August the 16th, 1969, in Chicago. Joni Mitchell was the opening act. The next day they headed over to this place in upstate New York called Woodstock. And there they performed their second ever gig in front of 400,000 people. Just before they went on, Stills remarked, "This is only the second time we've ever played in front of people. I'm scared shitless." They went on stage at 3 a.m. The set went down a storm and was immortalised in the Woodstock movie, which only fueled the band's huge popularity even further. The movie propelled the event to mythical status. It turned stars into legends, created some moments of pop culture that are still now ingrained in the collective unconscious. But not everyone was sold on the Woodstock dream. You might have noticed something missing if you've seen the Woodstock movie from the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young performance. Young was missing. Neil Young was there, playing and singing along with the band, but Neil Young refused to be filmed on stage by any of the movie cameras. Woodstock was a bullshit gig, he said later. Piece of shit. We played fucking awful. No one was into the music. Everybody was on this Hollywood trip with the fucking cameras. They were playing to the cameras. I could see everyone changing the performance for the camera, and I thought that was bullshit. I wouldn't let them film me. That's why I'm not in the movie. I said, one of you guys comes near me and I'm gonna fucking hit you with my guitar. I'm playing music. Just leave me out. Peace, love and flowers. CSNY would continue appearing at festivals throughout the remainder of '69, and they were no less eventful. At the Big Sur Festival in September, Stills, wired to the gills on marching powder, clad in a very expensive fur coat, leapt from the stage at one point to attack a heckler, whilst Crosby called for peace and love over the microphone. Next up was Altamont, which of course ended up in complete horror during the Stones set. An audience member was brutally stabbed to death. Earlier, during the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young set, Stills was stabbed in the leg by a Hell's Angel with a sharpened bicycle spoke. Afterwards, they requested not to be included in the subsequent movie Gimme Shelter. It wasn't just the craziness on stage, it was behind the scenes too. The dynamic between Stills and Young was one of intense competitiveness, mainly on Stills' part, according to Crosby, who said Stills always wanted to be better than Neil, but never could. Neil would never respond at the same level. Stephen would get loud, stacks and stacks of Marshall amps, and Neil would have 2 tiny little amps, and somehow still be louder. It drove Stephen crazy. It didn't help that everyone now was on coke. Apart from Young. Neil Young said so many crazy things happened. What the fuck was going on? What the fuck were they doing? I still have no idea. In October of '69, they started recording the album that came to be known as Deja Vu at Wally Hyder's San Francisco studio. Staying at a rundown motel in the heart of the Tenderloin district, Young brought with him 2 bush babies called Harriet and Speedy that he had bought from a pet store in Topanga. David Crosby's girlfriend, Christine Hinton, had just been killed in a head-on car collision at this time. He spent most of the time in his room snorting heroin, and then would come to the studio and sit on the floor and cry. Like the Buffalo Springfield days, Young would work on his songs mostly alone, and there were lots of overdubs. Country Girl harks back to Expecting to Fly in its epic structure and arrangement, but Helpless shows the other side, a minimalism not often seen with Crosby, Stills and Nash, creating one of the highlights of the album.
Blue, blue windows behind the stars. Yeah.
Deja Vu came out in March 1970, and it would quickly surpass the success of the first album. It remains to this day the group's biggest selling album, selling over 8 million copies. With more success came more and more money. Even Dallas Taylor was rolling in it, as he remarked later. In the beginning, nothing mattered but the music, and then nothing mattered but the money. And once that happens, you're doomed. Things only got more unhinged from here on in. Stills fired Greg Reeves from the band just before they started their second tour for becoming an Apache witch doctor. better. He also cited some musical concerns as well. His bass playing was too unpredictable for Stills. He was replaced by a homeless West Indian man called Fuzzy Samuels, who they had found in London, who self-admittedly played the entire first gig tripping on LSD. Dallas Taylor was the next to go. He had constant clashes with Young over song tempos, and Young was threatening to leave after that first gig. He was replaced by John Barbata of the Turtles. A week before that first gig, Young and Crosby were in San Francisco when they got the news about the Kent State shootings. Moved and motivated to express his feelings in a song as protest, Young picked up the guitar and wrote the song Ohio. Crosby was inspired also, and at his behest, he assembled the group and they recorded it more or less straight away and released it as quickly as possible. It became a hit, and although the song has its detractors, Ohio is, in my opinion, one of the group's high points collectively. They were all on board with the song, the feeling behind the song is genuine, and there were minimal overdubs with ad-libs from Crosby that give the song a fierce emotional punch. It's probably the most Neil Young-esque recording featuring Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and just shows you what an effective force they could be together as a foursome. Sometimes explicitly political songs can fall flat, especially further down the line when the events that inspired the song are a thing of the past and no longer in the public consciousness. However, Ohio seems to transcend that based on the emotion it expresses, which, when it comes down to it, is universal. Despite the very specific location and situation the song is singing about. Musically it is simple, but intense and direct, and for that, all the more effective. It's a great song, and you can't change my mind about that, so don't bother. It was backed with Stephen Stills' brilliant Find the Cost of Freedom, and the single was a hit. The group had momentum, so what happened next? Their 23-show tour continued, with tensions within the band at an all-time high, primarily due to Stills' raging nose powdering habit combined with constant boozing. Stills was now also taking up more and more time on stage, playing more solo songs and just generally overplaying during the songs, trying to outdo his bandmates, in particular Neil Young. Crosby, Nash and Young decided one night that they'd had enough and escaped to LA, leaving Stills in Chicago, oblivious, standing on stage for the sound check, saying, "Where the fuck is everyone?" In addition to this, Stills' girlfriend, Rita Coolidge, had left him for Nash. Nash himself assembled the best recordings from the tour to make up the double album Four-Way Street, which came out in 1971 and went to the top of the charts. However, CSNY, for now, had ceased to exist. All four did, however, release their own solo albums, with After the Gold Rush coming in September 1970, Stills' solo debut album in November, then Crosby's classic If I Could Only Remember My Name in February 1971, which had an amazing all-star cast featuring Jerry Garcia, Phil Lesh, Neil Young and many more, followed by Nash's Songs for Beginners in May of 71. These were all high-profile, successful releases, and this continued into 72, with Neil Young's Harvest spawning a #1 single with Heart of Gold. Stephen Stills formed Manassas with Chris Hillman from the Byrds, and they released a double album. Nash and Young released a single, War Song, which was in support of George McGovern's run for president against Richard Nixon. That didn't work as Richard Nixon won that election, but Nash and Crosby also released an album as a duo. And then in 1973 things turned a little darker. Young headed for the ditch, releasing Time Fades Away, a live album of completely new songs recorded after the death of Crazy Horse bandmate Danny Whitten.
14 junkies, 2 weeks to work.
Nash and Crosby had joined Neil Young halfway through his Harvest tour to sweeten the sound up a little bit. Young had taken to howling and yelping his way through a lot of the songs in the midst of his personal turmoil. He reaped the critical acclaim for his album, but it was a million miles away from the Immaculate Harvest. After coming off that tour, Young took his band into the studio and they recorded what would later become the album Tonight's the Night. The album plumbed the depths of grief so accurately that Reprise did not want to release it. It did eventually eventually come out in 1975. Crosby reunited the Byrds with a commercially successful album. Failed to excite the critics, but it contained covers of two Neil Young songs, Cowgirl in the Sand and See the Sky About to Rain, which hadn't actually been recorded yet by Neil Young. And they were excellent versions, by the way. The second Manassas record came out in April, Nash's second album too, but neither set the charts alight. Of all the CSNY albums that were released in 73, surprisingly, Time Fades Away, probably the rawest and least commercial of them all, sold the most, being certified gold in the US. In June and July 1973, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young met at Young's Ranch in California to record a new album named after one of Young's songs, Human Highway. However, the tensions were still there and they didn't get much done. The group went their separate ways again. They did get back together on stage at a Manassas concert at the Winterland Ballroom in the October of that year, but they didn't commit to a reunion straight away. And then over the next few months, Elliot Roberts convinced them that they should reunite and go back on tour together. So they did this, and Stephen Stills announced a Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young summer tour and studio album at one of his concerts in March 1974. They reassembled themselves that summer with some different musicians, including Tim Drummond on bass, who had played on Neil Young's Harvest album, and they went to rehearse at Neil Young's Ranch in California before going out on the 2-month, 31-day tour. The tour was absolutely huge for the time. Opening acts consisted of people such as Joni Mitchell, Santana, the band, the Beach Boys, and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Typically they would play for 3.5 hours. Crosby in particular was disillusioned on this tour with the sound. He dubbed it the Doom Tour. He said we had good monitors, but Stephen and Neil were punching well over 100 decibels from their half stacks. Graham and I simply couldn't do the harmonies properly when we couldn't hear ourselves. Also, he said that when you're playing in a stadium like that and you're not Mick Jagger moving about a lot, it's kind of hard to connect with the audience. The dates included a huge gig at Wembley Stadium. Now, at the time, they chose not to release any recordings of this tour. As Nash said, the feeling at the time, at the end of the tour, is that we weren't quite as good as we should have been. However, decades later, they did assemble the best recordings and release it as CSNY 1974. Now, at the time, they made the press believe that they'd got over the previous problems that they'd had together and everything was fine now, but behind the scenes, things were just as crazy as ever. Overblown, over the top. The spending was out of control on this tour. They had pillowcases embroidered with the band logo designed by Joni Mitchell. They would charter helicopters and private jets if they couldn't get transportation across the ground. The tour made over $11 million. The band members ended up with $500,000 each. A lot of money was spent on stuff. What kind of stuff did they spend the money on? Graham Nash said, they had a good time. Let's just put it that way. According to the road manager, Chris O'Dell, he said one time they spilled some cocaine on the carpet and they just got down on the floor and sniffed it off the carpet. Graham Nash says they were up all night. It was insane. He said, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody because the cocaine/quaalude ride should be in the Ride of Horrors at the circus. Things got even weirder when Stephen Stills started claiming that he had participated in clandestine Vietnam War missions as a member of the United States Marine Corps during his tenure in Buffalo Springfield. He stopped wearing his trademark football jerseys in favour of military fatigues and was hanging out a lot with his personal manager, Michael John Bowen, who was actually a Green Beret veteran. So each member of the band performed new songs as well as the old ones that later on appeared on their solo albums. Young premiered more than a dozen songs, including several from On the Beach, which was released during the tour. But as he grew more and more disillusioned with the other three, he would withdraw himself, often travelling separately in his own RV with his own entourage. Neil Young later said, "The tour was disappointing to me. I think CSN really blew it. They hadn't made an album and they didn't have any songs. How could they just stop like that?" Atlantic Records issued the compilation album So Far during the tour just to have something to promote. Nash hated it as it was just sort of the first two albums in a different order and only had one of their singles. It didn't even have Marrakesh Express on it, which was one of the biggest hits. But of course, like everything they did at this time, it was a huge success and it eventually topped the Billboard charts. Seemingly willing enough to overcome the tensions in the band, they attempted to record new material at Nash's home studio in San Francisco, and when that didn't work, they tried the record plant in Sausalito. Several songs were completed, including Young's Human Highway, which was also meant to be the title of the album, until Neil Young left once again after another argument. The remaining members attempted to carry on, no pun intended, to complete the album as just Crosby, Stills and Nash, but the feud between Stills and Nash now came to the fore, resulting in Stills destroying the master tape of Nash's song Wind on the Water with a razor blade after Crosby and Nash disagreed with him about a harmony part on Stills' song Guardian Angel. Stills tried to play it off like it was just a joke. That was the end for now of the CSNY story, as the Human Highway album was never completed. Young, of course, recorded Human Highway for his Comes a Time album in 1978 and used the title for his 1982 feature film. But those are some stories for another video, or maybe two or three. We'll pause the story of CSNY right there in 1974. The story does continue, and believe it or not, it gets even crazier, but we'll come back to the story in another video. Crosby, Stills and Nash was a whirlwind, but then when Young joined, it turned into a full-blown hurricane, and a lot of people got blown away. The group was a major force in the late 60s, early 70s, and there's no doubt being associated with them gave Young's career a huge boost, propelling him to a level of fame he probably never even envisaged. Thankfully, though, Young carried on making records that he believed in, and never let his newfound status affect him in the way that it perhaps had affected his friend, Stephen Stills. Young survived being in the most notorious supergroup of the 70s, and had managed to come out the other side with his artistry and integrity somehow still intact. That's a hell of an achievement in and of itself. But yeah, we'll just leave the story there, 1974, and we'll come back to it later. But yeah, thanks for watching. If you want to, you can support us for free by subscribing to this channel. But yeah, thanks for watching. Bye for now.